All right, welcome back, everybody. So, we're going to just keep going right on ahead with the top five quarterbacks now. So, to give a little bit of a recap, the I'll leave a link for the previous video too. Try to make this one be a little bit more mindful of time. Just, I could talk about this all day, really. But for the top 10, or from numbers 10 through 6, we had John Elway at number 10, Drew Brees at number 9, Johnny Unitas at number 8, Steve Young at number 7, and then Brett Favre at number 6. So now here we are at number 5, and we're going to roll right into it with the only quarterback on this list that does not have a Super Bowl ring, that being none other than Dan Marino. Now, Dan Marino is so fascinating because this is a quarterback who comes into the league in the 1983 draft, which was, I mean, really, you could still argue that it is the greatest draft for any quarterback class in the history of the league, although 2004 is definitely up there, and the jury's still out on the 2020 draft. It's looking very promising so far. But in this draft, we had, of course, John Elway at the top of the draft. We had Hall of Famer Jim Kelly, guys we already talked about. Um, Super Bowl 20 legend Tony Eason for the New England Patriots. Joking, of course. And then falling all the way down to number 20. Oh, and even Ken O'Brien for the Jets at 24. But falling all the way down to 27 was none other than Dan the Man Marino. Um, so then he comes into the league in 1983, right out of the gate with Miami. He only plays with Miami in his career. Um, 7-2 record in 9 games as a starter. 20 touchdowns, only 6 interceptions. So not a bad start at all in the early 80s for Dan. Um, and we'll see as we go along here. He's definitely a quarterback who is um, very has a lot of very fantastic statistical seasons, but really just doesn't have a great team around him. Miami just couldn't put it together around him to replicate the success they had in the 1970s with Don Shula. So in his rookie year, he finishes second for Offensive Rookie of the Year, third in the MVP voting, third for Offensive Player of the Year. He gets second team All Pro and a Pro Bowler. So right away, Dan Marino has established a name for himself in the league, and he is part of this group of quarterbacks in the 80s that is absolutely legendary. Of course, we've already talked about Warren Moon, Jim Kelly, John Elway, um, to a lesser extent Steve Young. Like I said, I consider him more of a 1990s quarterback, but and now Dan Marino. So his first year, they get into the playoffs and just to play one game, he goes 0-1. Throws for 193 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. So not bad. Not a bad rookie year at all for Dan Marino. But really, he just absolutely bursts onto the scene in his sophomore year in 1984. He comes out here with, I mean, good lord, 14-2 record for the Miami Dolphins, and I believe they had the lowest ranked defense, not 32nd. There were fewer teams then. Um, the worst ranked defense in the league that season, but 5,084 yards with 48 touchdowns and 17 interceptions. This is just, I can't even fathom these numbers. These are the kind of numbers that if somebody were to put these up today, we'd be giving them the MVP in the year 2022. And he was doing this back in 1984. And you'll notice that this is a trend with Dan Marino. A lot of his stats, a lot of his records still hold up with quarterbacks who play in the 21st century in a much more pass friendly league. So he ends up winning the MVP, Offensive Player of the Year, first team All Pro. Um, and again a Pro Bowler in his second season. And Miami goes all the way to the Super Bowl this season, Super Bowl 19 against none other than Joe Montana, Bill Walsh, and the San Francisco 49ers. Now, um, obviously, we know the story. San Francisco wins that Super Bowl, but really seemed like it was setting the stage for a Montana versus Marino rivalry, really made a name for himself that season. So moving along, um, 1985, another 12-4 season, 2 games in the playoffs, 3 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. Um, Kind of seems to be a trend with these Miami teams where Dan will have these fantastic regular seasons, but they just end up coming up small in the playoffs if they even make the playoffs, much like how we discussed with Drew Brees earlier on in the video, or in the prior video, I guess I should say. Um, so then we get to 1986, again, 4,700 yards passing, 44 touchdowns, 23 interceptions. I mean, that's not ideal, but still, this is in the mid 80s. It's a completely different kind of ball than we're talking today. Um, he ends up finishing third in the MVP voting. Again, first team All Pro for the third year in a row now, second Offensive Player of the Year. And this would end up being the last time he gets first team All Pro, actually. He does end up winning second team All Pro later on in his career, but we'll notice that the Dolphins and Marino have some speed bumps here as we get into the late 80s, into the early 90s. And yeah, so let's see. So we get into, I mean, his numbers are never really bad. His touchdowns are always outpacing his interceptions. Although he does top 20 interceptions a couple times here, 1988 again, 1989. Um, but his touchdowns are solid. So 87, 88, and 89, he has 26 touchdowns, 28 touchdowns, 24 touchdowns. We get to the 90s, and he starts to clean up the interceptions down to just 11, 13, 16, and 1992. While his touchdowns are still in that early 20 range, 21 touchdowns in 1990, 25 in 1991, then 24 in 1992. So he's just putting together, he's just accumulating an incredible body of work over all this time, just consistently delivering, especially considering he really didn't have all that much talent around him, um, which seems to be a trend with some of these quarterbacks. He's kind of stuck in the same situation that a guy like John Elway was, um, which is crazy that somebody like Jim Kelly, who did have a very loaded roster in Buffalo, I mean, we saw it. They were able to get the 4 straight Super Bowls, but just couldn't get over the top. No real fault to Jim Kelly on that. I mean, the one they literally got down to the very last play with the field goal. So um, now as we get towards the mid 90s here, Dan Marino, I mean, has injury riddled 1993 season. Still not bad in the 5 games he played. 4-1 record, 8 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. Um, and by this point, they really hadn't been in the playoffs much between 1980 from 1985 to 1994. Miami only made the playoffs 2 times, those being in 1990 and 1992. Um, those 2 seasons each have a 1-1 record, so they win 1 game, lose in the next round. Dan Marino has in 1990 5 touchdowns, 2 interceptions on 544 yards. Then in 1992, 435 yards, 4 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. So not bad at all. Um, Again, like Drew Brees, he really doesn't have bad statistical seasons by any means. Just seems to be that the talent is lacking around him, which is why we don't. I mean, if this were a best team of all time list, this list would look a lot different, obviously. It's why we don't judge it solely on rings. If that were the case, Terry Bradshaw would be up at number 2 on this list, but obviously we're not talking about him. Um, so even today, looking back on it, I just have here the all-time passing leaders list, and Dan Marino still to this very day is number 8 all-time in passing yards. Um, which says so much because the league has become so much more passer friendly over the years. And then let's look at passing touchdowns here as well. Here he's even number 7. He has exactly 420 passing touchdowns. Philip Rivers is number 6. He only has 421. So I mean, that really shows just how much his numbers hold up over the course of time. Really has aged like a fine wine. I feel like if Dan Marino were to play in the 2000s, or definitely the 2010s or the 2020s, we'd be seeing just as strong of a performance, if not an even stronger performance, especially if he had better teams around him. So then we start getting into the twilight years of his career. So even Dan Marino isn't immune to this mid-career lull that we were mentioning earlier. He has got that taste of the Super Bowl in 1984, but just really couldn't seem to get back after that. I mean, spoiler alert, he never gets back to the Super Bowl, but he even struggles just getting back into the playoffs with Miami here. Then get to the mid 90s, and Don Shula is dismissed as head coach of the Dolphins. They try to recreate the magic of the Dallas Cowboys by bringing in Jimmy Johnson, but that really doesn't work out. Dan Marino, 1995, has, I'm sorry, 1994 actually, this was when Shula was still there. 2 games started, 5 touchdowns, 0 interceptions in 2 games as a starter. So again, really solid numbers for Marino, but doesn't result in the ring, which is the one thing that's always seems to be brought up when people talk about him in the rankings all the time. And I know there's even some people who will say number 5's too low for Dan Marino. He should be a top 3 quarterback. I mean, for a while I was even in the camp that he should be in discussion for number 1 of all time, which, if that's your opinion, I mean, I think that's completely valid. I think there's absolutely a case to be made that Dan Marino might be the greatest passer of all time. He was a man out of time. If he was somebody who was putting up 2010s numbers in the 1980s. So then we move on here to once Jimmy Johnson arrives, and then that's when you really start to see the wheels falling off for Dan Marino. Not that it was anything horrifically bad his last couple of seasons, but just starts regressing gradually every year. So get to 1995, 3,600 yards, 24 touchdowns, 15 interceptions. Again, like, this is a solid season. This was typical for him in his career, but then we start getting further down here. 96, only 13 games played, so starting to battle an injury bug a little bit. Only 17 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. 97, 16 touchdowns, 11 interceptions. And he's really not in the discussion for any individual accolades by this point in his career. 1994 and 1995, he was again second team All-Pro. Those are the other 2 years I mentioned earlier. But even then, Miami's records aren't anything impressive. They don't have more than 10 wins, it looks like, here after 19... Well, I'm sorry, yeah, from in the 90s, they only get over 10 wins one time, and that was in 1992. So we get down here towards the end of his career, 1998. I mean, he's still chugging along, 23 touchdowns, 15 interceptions. The wheels haven't fallen off yet, but then age 38 season, 1999, just 11 games started, just shy of 2,500 yards, only 12 touchdowns and 17 interceptions. So yeah, kind of an ugly exit for Dan Marino. Then get to the playoffs in 1999, and this is where it really gets rough for him. They do win the wild card round. I believe it was over the Colts, if I recall correctly, but then in the divisional round, they lose to the Jacksonville Jaguars, and that was really ugly. It was a 62-7 defeat, which really just sent him out. I'm sorry, it was the Seahawks they beat in the wild card round. I believe Indianapolis lost to the Titans in the other divisional round matchup that year. Then that was the year of the Music City Miracle wild card round. So Titans beat the Bills, then they go into Indianapolis, beat the Colts, and then they would go on to beat the Jaguars and of course lose 1 yard short to the Rams in Super Bowl 34. But so yeah, they lose back to Dan Marino and the Dolphins. They lose 62-7 to the Jacksonville Jaguars. intra-Florida matchup, the divisional round. Just really sends him out of his career with his tail between his legs. Throws 2 interceptions in that game, but couldn't even clear 100 yards. Only throws for 95 yards in that game. And like a lot of these other quarterbacks, his career just ends with a whimper, which, I mean, you really hate to see that. You do. Because this was a guy who did deserve a Super Bowl ring. He deserved better than what he got from Miami. And Miami really hasn't had a quarterback of that caliber since then. Not even close, I would say. Um, so, yeah, you could argue Dan Marino's place on this list. I think number 5 is really the floor for him. I think if you're moving him anywhere, it's only up. Um, but I mean, we're getting into the best of the best now. So these top 4 guys, it's really hard to dispute their place. I feel. I know there might be a little bit of controversy with what's to come, but we'll evaluate that as we go, I suppose. So moving on to number 4. Now, number 4. This might be a little bit unpopular, but this is where I'm going to throw in Joe Montana, of course, from the San Francisco 49ers and later the Kansas City Chiefs. The driving force of the West Coast offense in the early 80s, really transformative player, revolutionized the league, absolutely, made it more of a passing league. Him alongside Dan Marino, Jim Kelly, Warren Moon, um, John Elway, of course, several other players. I mean, we could go on all day. Phil Simms, Dan Fouts, just so many elite quarterbacks in the 1980s that came out here. But the one that I think really stands above the pack is Joe Montana, because he's really just the complete package when you look at it. His numbers aren't as impressive as Dan Marino's by any means. I'd say it's actually not even close. Dan Marino's numbers are far more impressive, but Montana has, I mean, let's break it down here, right? So Montana comes into the league in 1979, only starts 1 game, so can't really evaluate much there. Just only 23 pass attempts. 1980 starts 7 games, 15 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, just shy of 1,800 yards. So not a bad start at all. And then 1981's, this is the first year he starts all 16 games, and he throws for 3,500 yards, 19 touchdowns, and 12 interceptions, leading San Fran to a 13-3 record, and they would go on to win the Super Bowl this year. So while Dan Marino was in the Super Bowl his second year of his career in 1984, Joe Montana was in it his third year in the league, really his first full year as a starter, and he gets over the hump right away, so he doesn't have to worry about any of that talk about how he can't win the big one and all the nonsense that comes along with that Dan Marino had to deal with, that John Elway had to deal with for so long, that Jim Kelly had to deal with. And you'll see one of the quarterbacks coming up on this list will certainly had to have dealt with that as well. But moving along, 1982, I mean, another solid season, 17 touchdowns, 11 interceptions, only 2,600 yards. He battled injury this year, I believe, though, only 9 games played, or this might have been another strike-shortened season. Let me double check on that. It was just until week 2 of the regular season, so this wasn't injury season. So not bad numbers by any means, but this just also puts into perspective how incredible Dan Marino's numbers were, because just 2 years later, he would throw for 48 touchdowns and 5,000 yards in the same season. So really just let that sink in. Just keep that in the back of your head as we're going through Joe Montana's numbers here. 1983, 26-12, 3,900 yards, 10-6 record for San Fran. So they're still figuring themselves out. And this is what I meant earlier when I was talking about with Steve Young in his portion, that San Fran really wasn't at their height until like the late 80s. And even though they won in 1981, they were still very much figuring themselves out in the early 80s. Then we get to 1984, and even here they end up winning their second Super Bowl this year, but he goes 28-10, so he's gradually getting better. He's making progress each year here. They go 14-1, so San Fran was definitely coming into their own as a team by this point, though they do end up taking some steps back slightly over the next couple of years. Then let's look at his playoff numbers here so far. So 1981, he plays 3 games, of course, 3-0 record, 747 yards with 6 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. Not bad at all. You will take that all day, especially when it ends in a Super Bowl win. 1983, 2 games started, 4 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. Again, very hard to argue with that. And then we get to 1984, 7 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, and 3 games started with 873 passing yards. So he's steadily getting better. Then we get to 1985, 1986, and 1987. This is where he starts to hit a bit of a speed bump here. And, if you're the coach of this team, Bill Walsh just won 2 Super Bowls a little bit earlier here. Yeah, this might be valid reason for you want to bring in a little bit of competition, not necessarily to overtake Joe Montana as the starting quarterback, but more so just to give him a little bit of a push that he really needs to just kind of motivate him to do a little bit better. So let's see here. So in the playoffs then in 85, 86, and 87, they're one and done all 3 of these seasons. And Joe Montana actually fails to throw a single touchdown in all 3 of these seasons, which is very surprising looking back on it, because as we'll see later on, in 1988, the Beast wakes up and he really just comes into his own in the playoffs. And those next 2 seasons, like I said, that's the height of San Fran, in my opinion. Their run in the 80s, and I think that was really the height of Joe Montana when he was really coming into his own. So let's get into it here. So in 1988, they go 8-5 in 13 games the Montana started. He throws just shy of 3,000 passing yards, 18 touchdowns, and 10 interceptions. And you might be thinking, well, that's not overly impressive. What's so special about that? But then we get to the playoffs. In the 1988 playoffs, he starts 3 games, 3-0 record, ends in his 3rd Super Bowl ring at this point. He throws 823 yards for 8 touchdowns and just 1 interception. So very impressive stuff here from Joe Montana. Now with his 3rd ring, he's starting to come into his own. And then 1989, it's more of the same. The regular season, he picks up right where he left off. I mean, it wasn't an overly impressive regular season. None of his regular seasons are like eye-popping stats like Dan Marino's were, but he's very consistently good for most of his regular seasons here. So 1989, 13 games started. San Fran has an 11-2 record. He throws 1,300 yards, 26 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. I mean, you'll take that. It's a solid season, especially in 1989. But then this playoff run, though, this is his best season, I would say, by far. This is his moment, like we discussed with the other quarterbacks earlier, where they, like, when you look back on his career, like what season do you remember Joe Montana for? I feel like this has to be the one. 1989, 3 games started in the playoffs, 800 yards on the dot, 11 touchdowns, which was a 13.3 touchdown percentage, since he only threw 83 passes in these playoffs. So 11 of those were touchdowns. Think about that. So when he drops back to pass in the 89 playoffs, for every 7 to 8 passes, every 7 to 8 times he lets go of the ball, it's a touchdown. And none of those 83 times he threw the ball were interceptions. Absolutely remarkable. And then they just absolutely, let me pull up the Super Bowl here, because I'm pretty sure this was the year they played the Bengals and just absolutely embarrassed them. Oh, I'm sorry, it was the Broncos, excuse me. 55-10. I believe this was the Black 59 Razor game where he just goes absolutely bonkers. I want to say this was in the Superdome. And the 49ers went into this game favored by 12, but my God, they scored consistently 13 points in the first quarter, 14, and then 14 in the second, third, and fourth quarter, 55-10. Just absolutely embarrassed poor John Elway and the Broncos. So this is really, though, where it seems like everything's going well for Joe Montana here. He's age 33 going on 34. You'd think he'd still have a lot left in the tank, or at least something notable left in the tank, but things just kind of hit a wall here for him. He has a solid regular season again the next year. It looks like they're rolling again. They go 14-1 in 15 games he starts, 26 touchdowns, 16 interceptions, but ends up getting injured in the NFC Championship game, as we discussed earlier, and that's where Steve Young ends up entering the picture permanently. Montana misses all of 91 with an elbow injury, and then by 92, Steve Young is the MVP of the league, so he doesn't really even get to see the field again for San Francisco, at least not in a meaningful way. He doesn't start. He only appears in one game, and he didn't even start it in 1992. So, I mean, to round out his career, he finishes up in Kansas City. They ship him off there in 1993. It's actually an odd trend I've noticed with the 49ers and Chiefs. Like, the Chiefs really seem to enjoy the 49ers retreads at the quarterback position. But 1993, with the Kansas City Chiefs, starts 11 games, 8-3 record, 13 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. So not bad at all. Not bad at all. And he ends up taking them to the AFC title game that year against Buffalo. 700 yards in 3 games in the playoffs, 4 touchdowns, just three interceptions. I won't say just 3 interceptions, but for age 37 season, after really not playing in 3 years, that's solid. It showed he still had some life left in him. And then he only played one more season in 1994, where, again, wasn't bad. He started 14 games, 3,200 yards, 16 touchdowns, and just 9 interceptions. But then in the playoffs that year, they get bounced first round, one and done. He throws 314 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception. So, I mean, that's pretty solid for his last game in the league. Definitely didn't go out with a whimper by any means. Definitely not like Dan Marino did, or Brett Favre, some of those other guys. Definitely didn't go out on top like a John Elway, but solid end to a solid career. I'll say that. So moving on to, well, before we move on, I guess I'll just give one more note on Joe Montana. Number 4, he could be higher or lower for sure. If you wanted to say Dan Marino was above him, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. And if you wanted to say, oh, well, Joe Montana's number 2 because of the 4 rings, I mean, I won't take that away from you either. He does win. He actually does win the MVP twice here, 1989 and 1990, the season he got injured in the championship game. But those are the only 2 MVPs he had. And that looks like he has 2 second team All Pros, and then another 3 first team All Pros. So, again, as we discussed earlier, solid combination of individual accolades, team success, and just, of course, just natural talent, just natural poise in the pocket. This was Joe Cool, you know. Yes, he did play in Bill Walsh's offense in the 1980s, probably the ideal place in the ideal time for a quarterback, but I mean, you can't really hold that against him. He was there and he thrived in it. I mean, obviously, that is taken into consideration a little bit. Otherwise, maybe he would be a little higher on this list. Especially considering he only throws for 30 touchdowns one time here in 1987. I think, like we said earlier, Dan Marino threw for 48 touchdowns in 1984. I cannot stress enough how impressive that is with 5,000 yards. I don't believe Montana ever even tops 4,000. So if you wanted to flip-flop those 2, I completely understand that. If you wanted to say Montana should be higher because of all the rings, again, understand it. But my criteria with the rings is more so the first one is the most important one. Anything after that's gravy. And with the 4 Super Bowl rings for the 49ers, it's a 53-man team. So it definitely shows that they had a very strong group around him. And he definitely was a key part of that, but it was more so a team effort. So we'll have him in at number 4. I feel like that's a very appropriate place to have Joe Montana here. So moving on to number 3. Now this is really where it starts to get interesting. So I believe this is the only player on the list who is still playing in the NFL. And this might be a little bit unpopular as well, but at number 3, I'm going to go with Aaron Rodgers. I know a lot of people might think, oh, well, that's too high. He only has the one Super Bowl. He's still playing. But for me, and he didn't even start his first 3 seasons. But for me, Aaron Rodgers, he is definitely an evolution of the Brett Favre type of quarterback. I mean, he studied behind him for 3 years, as we all know, but um, he gets drafted in 2005, and he comes into the league with a chip on his shoulder already. He sits on draft night. He thought he was going to go first to the 49ers. Alex Smith gets taken instead. He slips all the way down to the mid-20s where the Packers end up selecting him. And it was definitely a surprise pick at the time because the Packers had Brett Favre. Why would they, he was a Hall of Fame quarterback. Why would they take another one? But like with um, Montana and Young, it ended up working out for Brett Favre having that great 2007 season, and ended up working out for the Packers where they ended up having a great quarterback, another Hall of Fame quarterback to follow him up. But in this case, the successor actually exceeds the original. And I honestly don't even think that's a discussion. I think Aaron Rodgers is the far superior quarterback to Brett Favre. I mean, if anybody has a counter argument to that, I would love to hear it. I think there definitely could be a case to be made, but the big difference for me is Aaron Rodgers just takes care of the football so much better than Brett Favre did, but he has all the other amazing things that Brett Favre brought to the table. So he comes into the league as a starter in 2008 once Brett Favre goes to the Jets. And they only go 6-10 that first year, but he puts up some solid numbers. He has 28 touchdowns, 13 interceptions, and he was definitely seen as an up-and-coming quarterback in the league. Then we go to 2009. The Packers go 11-5, get a wild card spot, 30 touchdowns, just 7 interceptions. I mean, this is where it really looks like, all right, Aaron Rodgers. At this point, Aaron Rodgers establishes himself as a top 5 quarterback in the NFL and really doesn't look back. I mean, you could still there's still people saying for the 2023 season, Aaron Rodgers is projected to be a top 5 quarterback. I don't necessarily agree with that, but the argument is still absolutely out there. 2009, they end up playing a absolute shootout with the Cardinals. They lose in the wild card round. He throws 423 yards, 4 touchdowns, and just 1 interception. And this is something I'll say with Aaron Rodgers too. Much like when I was talking about Drew Brees earlier, Aaron Rodgers he's kind of, I won't say opposite of Drew Brees, but he kind of proves my point about, because I love comparing these two, especially much like Rodgers and Favre are great to compare, but Rodgers and Brees I think are also fantastic to compare because played in the same conference over largely the same era. And the difference is while both of them each won just one Super Bowl ring, Rodgers got into the playoffs deeper, more consistently, and even though they did lose some heartbreaking games, Rodgers always consistently delivered in the playoffs when it comes to how well he played. He really had some memorable games in the playoffs, as we'll see. So then moving on to 2010, this was, of course, we know how this ends. Ends with them winning Super Bowl 45 in Dallas against the Pittsburgh Steelers, stopping Ben Roethlisberger from winning his 3rd Super Bowl ring. And he throws in the regular season 28 touchdowns, 11 interceptions. They sneak in as the 6th seed, beat wild card round, go on to steamroll Atlanta in the 2nd round, and then poor Caleb Haney in the conference championship game. They just embarrassed that man. But then they go to the Super Bowl against the Steelers, where he gets his Super Bowl MVP. I mean, which is funny because if you ask Aaron Rodgers, he'll say he thought he didn't even play very well in that game, and he did definitely take some hits. He was under consistent pressure. Fantastic Steelers defense. Some great playmakers over there. James Harrison, Mar Woodley, Troy Polamalu, so many others. Just definitely a tall task for them to overcome. Definitely the strongest team I would say they faced in that whole playoff run. The Steelers had their sights set on that Super Bowl for sure. And then once Rodgers won that Super Bowl in 2010, Super Bowl 45, the narrative around him was this is the start of a new era. This is going to be the guy of the 2010s. This is going to be like, I mean, yeah, at the time, Tom Brady had, I'll say only 3 rings. He had only 3 rings because he ends up winning more than double that when all's said and done, but who would have guessed it? Peyton Manning had just 1 Super Bowl ring. Drew Brees had just the one the year before that, and that was seen as an up-and-coming rivalry. But Aaron Rodgers was seen as an emerging face of the league. It was largely seen as him and Drew Brees. They were going to be the new Peyton and Brady, with Rodgers being potentially even better because Rodgers was somebody who had the potential to put up Peyton-like stats, but also win. Same with Drew Brees, honestly, but I felt like Rodgers' ceiling was definitely higher, even at the time. Um, so it's really tragic that he never ends up getting back, not even getting back to the Super Bowl with Green Bay, although he does have many memorable playoff runs, many conference championship appearances after this. In 2011, this was as good a place to start as any, because going into this season, I thought Green Bay was going to just steamroll the league and go take the Super Bowl, which, I mean, they steamrolled the league. They just didn't take the Super Bowl. They go 15-1 that season. Rodgers throws 45 touchdowns, a 9.0 touchdown percentage, which is remarkable, and just a 1.2 interception percentage, which this is going to be a trend with Aaron Rodgers. He does not like throwing interceptions. He takes care of the football, which I think he probably learned that from watching Brett Favre for those first few years, right? Especially his rookie year. I believe that was the year we talked about where Brett Favre threw 29 interceptions. He's probably sitting there on the sidelines like, oh, I won't do that. So 2011, they go 15-1, but then they get to the divisional round at home and they get one and done. They get knocked out right away to the New York Giants, who, I mean, they still had a solid defense. I don't think it was as good as the 2007 defense. I think most people would agree with that, and maybe their offense was a little bit better, but I don't think the Giants like. This is the same thing with Drew Brees. Like I felt they lost to an inferior team here. This was a year where Rodgers really should have made it further than that. They probably should have won the Super Bowl this year, in all honesty. I mean, we really can't tell in hindsight because they would have had to win 2 more games even if they did beat the Giants. But man, when you go 15-1 with those kind of numbers, and he wins his first MVP here as well, you just expect more. And the playoffs again, like he doesn't play bad. So, I guess I'll mention his 2010 stats since I didn't say that. He throws over 1,000 yards in the playoffs because they did play 4 games since they were a wild card team, 9 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. But even in that game against the Giants in 2011, 264 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. So not bad at all. Moving on to 2012, this is where like he continues putting up good numbers, but Green Bay just kind of like it seems like they're just slowly getting further and further from that Super Bowl. They're clinging on to it. They're clinging on to McCarthy, Clay Matthews, Charles Woodson, the key players on that team. Uh, Greg Jennings for a little bit, though he did leave shortly thereafter to the Vikings. Jordy Nelson, but continues to put up great stats. He doesn't throw. I mean, after 2010, he doesn't throw double-digit touchdowns again until just last season, his last year in Green Bay. So every season since then, the most touchdowns he threw in a season was 8, and that was in 2012 and 2015. And some of these years, he even throws as little as 4 in 2019 and 2021, which is, I can't even wrap my head around that one. Like this, such an efficient quarterback. Like this is what you want out of the position, and he really opened things up for the guys playing now, I feel like, where he really had a strong ability to throw on the run. And he was somebody who earlier on in his career, he could scramble too. I mean, he still can a little bit. Like he's probably like more of a statue quarterback now since pretty much every quarterback can run now. But back around 2010, 2011, you compare him to guys like Breeze, Brady, and Peyton, he was seen as more of a running quarterback. Obviously, not as much as a guy like Michael Vick, but he could get outside the pocket and make some plays. Definitely kind of a precursor to a Patrick Mahomes kind of quarterback. I feel like a lot of people will compare Mahomes to Brett Favre, but I feel like Rodgers is definitely the stepping stone between the two of those guys. Really bridge that gap. And honestly, even for as great as Mahomes is, Rodgers, I think he might even be a little bit more efficient than Mahomes, honestly, at least in some ways here, because it's just so consistent too. We haven't seen it over this long a period of time from Patrick Mahomes, at least not yet. I mean, he's still getting better, so the jury's still out on that. We could be looking back at this 5, 10 years from now saying Patrick Mahomes is firmly in the top three all time here, but right now I think Aaron Rodgers has really solidified himself in that top three, especially as he's now at age 40. It's not like he has a ton of ball left in him. He's coming up on the end of the road. He might continue to take a little bit of a step back here, although it'd be interesting now that he's on a new team for the first time in his career how things go. But I mean, we look at really the story with him. Amazing statistical seasons, consistently throws right around 40 touchdowns and under 10, always under 10 interceptions. Um, and then he goes on to win another MVP in 2014. They go to the conference championship that year where they lose a heartbreaker to Seattle with the onside kick, Brian Bostic cinder block for hands. Then 2015, this was the year they had that duel in Arizona with him and Carson Palmer, the Jeff Janis game where they had less than a minute to go, 4th and 20 inside their own 10, and he throws a Hail Mary to Jeff Janis in midfield, and then he does it again for a touchdown to send it to overtime. Um, so when people say Rodgers isn't a good quarterback in the playoffs, that's simply not true. He's a guy he's made some plays in the playoffs, and let's look at his playoff numbers here. So 2012, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception. 2013, they go one and done, but 1 touchdown, no interceptions. 2014, 2 games played. They win the Dez drop that game and then lose to Seattle. Just shy of 500 yards, 4 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. So his taking care of the football continues in the playoffs. He doesn't have a single year in the playoffs where he throws more than 2 interceptions. Something his predecessor in Green Bay certainly couldn't say. Looking at 2001 there for sure. So 2016, they win that Mason Crossbar game in Dallas. Aaron Rodgers really has a way of getting in the Cowboys' head, which I mean, as an Eagles fan, love to see that. But 3 games played in 2016, over 1,000 yards again, 9 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, and then he really kind of avoids the mid-career lull. Like they do have a couple of years in 2017 and 18 where they missed the playoffs, but they come back very strong 2019, 20, and 2021 with fantastic regular seasons. And that it's a shame because any of those 3 years I felt like Green Bay could have won the Super Bowl. These were all still really fresh. 13-3, all 3 of those seasons. Wins the MVP the last 2 of those seasons. I mean, good Lord, that 2020 season, I really don't think it gets brought up enough of how strong a season that was. 48 touchdowns to just 5 interceptions. That's I don't think you could ask for much better from a quarterback than that. And we want to talk about some of the all-time greatest seasons for a quarterback. That might be the one. That really might be the one. That's just so impressive. And this was at age 37 too, so shows that he's mentally come a long way as a quarterback. Um, but he still has that arm. He still can put the ball exactly where it needs to be. Um, and even like his yards per completion don't really dip down here. It's right around like 11, 12 yards his entire career. So Aaron Rodgers, story's still being written, but right now I have him at number 3. I don't really see him dropping below that spot in the future. I mean, even if he gets his teeth kicked in this year with the Jets and has a horrible season, and even if he plays 2 years with the Jets and they're both absolutely dreadful and he retreats into the darkness in 2024, 2025 as a 41-year-old quarterback, he's a first ballot Hall of Famer. He's still top 3 in my opinion. He's still more impressive than the guys we mentioned before, just because he really puts it all together. Like, he has the complete package. I think the one aspect he probably isn't as strong on might be the leadership, but who am I to say that? I'm not in the locker room, right? I mean, we know some of these guys have a rep, like, we hear things and we know guys have a reputation for being a great leader, but how do we really know, right? It's so easy to sit here and say, like, oh, well, Tom Brady's a great leader. Look at all the Super Bowls he won. And I mean, he absolutely is. Um, not trying to take anything away from Tom, just using him as an example, but I know that might be something people look at with Aaron and say, oh, well, he might not be a good leader because he only has the one ring. Relax. 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 Let's move on to number two. So, number two, I mean, I think everybody knows now who one and two are. And for a while, I did have these guys in kind of an interchangeable order. And for a while, I did have this guy number one until just a couple of years ago. And that's Peyton Manning. I mean, if you want to talk about revolutionizing the game, look no further. Like, we want to talk about just the mental side of the game, the pre-snap side of the game. Like, what this guy is basically an offensive coordinator at the line of scrimmage. He had plenty of great coaches over the years, but let's be real, he's the sheriff. He was running that offense through and through, whether it was with the Colts, whether it was with the Broncos. Peyton Manning, it was like having a coach on the field and then also having just a tremendous arm to go along with it. So he comes into the league in 1998 as the first overall pick. Funny enough, he was actually considered kind of a coin flip pick with Ryan Leaf this year. Indy made the right choice, absolutely, in hindsight. He comes in, has a rough go about his rookie year, throwing 28 interceptions, but he's figuring it out. He's learning. The Colts had a bad team. He was the first overall pick, which surprisingly, a lot of the guys on this list, now that I look at it, really weren't first overall picks. I think Elway might have been the only other one who was a first overall pick. Um, so it definitely shows, though, like, coming in, being the number one overall pick isn't really a great thing, especially as a rookie quarterback, a young quarterback. He's only 22 years of age here, coming into a last place Colts team. So, I mean, 28 interceptions, I understand that. I'm not going to hold that against him. And he did have Marshall Faulk that year helping him out, trying to help him learn the ways of the league. But he ends up figuring it out pretty much right away his second year. They move on from Marshall Faulk, but drafted Jerian James to replace him. Has Marvin Harrison still as his go-to target. 26 touchdowns, 15 interceptions, 4,000 passing yards. Spoiler alert, 4,000 yards is like pretty much Peyton's benchmark here. He only has one season and between, other than his first and his last season, he has just 1 year where he fails to crack 4,000 yards. So this guy was a statistical machine in every sense of the definition. Um, Always in the running for MVP. Always in the running for the first team and second team All Pros. Always leading the Colts to great regular season records. Um, but this is again somebody who he he had to deal with a couple things. He had to deal with having to get that monkey off his back of winning a Super Bowl like Steve Young did. But with Peyton, I'd say it was arguably even worse because he was a starter right away, and he doesn't end up winning a Super Bowl until, we'll get there, but it's almost a full decade into his career. And he also has to deal with, in the process, they are losing to some inferior teams like we saw with Drew Brees, and we also see he doesn't have the best postseason performances in here. They're not awful, but for somebody as good as Peyton is in the regular season, you just expect a little bit more. So, especially during the era, this is when Tom Brady and Peyton were the two-headed monster of the AFC, and then even the Steelers to a lesser degree. Peyton was always coming up short in the playoffs, so he had to deal with a lot of criticism, especially being the first overall pick, Archie's son, all the hype around him, all the individual accolades he receives. He definitely had to deal with a lot of media criticism. Um, but let's really look into this here. So we get into the 2000s. Well, like I mentioned earlier, even in '99, they get one and done in the first round after they go 13-3. Then in 2000, it's the same thing. They go 10-6, one and done in the playoffs. 2001, 6-10, they miss the playoffs. Then we get to 2002. I believe this was Dungy's first season as coach with the Colts. So Jim Moore's gone, couldn't make the playoffs, but um, Tony Dungy comes in. I'm sorry, yeah, Tony Dungy comes in from Tampa Bay in 2002. His old team actually wins the Super Bowl that year with John Gruden in Tampa Bay, but Dungy steers the Colts back to the playoffs. They get one and done with the Jets. Peyton only throws 137 yards, no touchdowns, 2 picks, so he's starting to feel the heat here. He definitely could have been playing better. 2003, he understands this, comes out with a fire, definitely steps it up. The Colts go 12-4, throws 4,200 yards, 29 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. And this was the year he shares the MVP with Steve McNair, something that we haven't seen since then, and I don't know if we'll ever see again. And he gets his first team All-Pro. But I think a lot of people will remember this season for how it ends. This is the first time we get to see Brady and Peyton face off in the playoffs, and it's in the conference championship game, so the stakes were definitely high. The Patriots had won the Super Bowl 2 years before this, and it was kind of seen as a bit of a fluky ring. They were a team that kind of came out of nowhere. They missed the playoffs the next year in 2002, so the Colts win this game in 2003. I mean, Peyton's in the driver's seat. He gets that Super Bowl. He's neck and neck with Tom, and I mean, he has the MVP under his belt. I mean, you could definitely say that Peyton Manning's the best quarterback in the league, hands down. I mean, a lot of people still did for a while after this, even though they lost the game, but he doesn't play well. Patriots read him like a book. Romeo Crennel had him figured out, and we know the story. Patriots go on to win their second Super Bowl in 3 years. 2004, and this this was where Peyton really takes off here. 49 touchdowns to just 10 interceptions, runs away with the MVP. This is this is his best season with the Colts, I'll say that. And this is definitely one of the best quarterback seasons of all time. And you could say it really holds up compared to some of the other ones. Like, we'll definitely mention Tom Brady has a fantastic season as well. Some of the seasons Aaron Rodgers had. But we look at 2004 here. Only 497 pass attempts, 49 touchdowns. So think about that. For 16 straight games, 16 straight weeks, every time Peyton Manning dropped back and threw a pass and let go of it, out of every 10 times he let go of the ball, one of them was a touchdown. And he only threw 10 interceptions that entire season, which was very close to his career best. His career best was 9 in 2006. And other than that, 10 was his career low. So absolutely a masterpiece by Peyton Manning here. But then we get to the playoffs. Win the wild card round. They face, yet again, Tom Brady, Bill Belichick, New England Patriots in that second round. That vicious Patriots defense, all that amazing talent, linebacker position, the defensive line, Richard Seymour, Mike Vrabel, so many others, Rodney Harrison, Asante Samuel. I mean, my God, I could go on and on. There's so many of them. But Willie McGinnis, they eat him alive yet again. The Patriots go on to win their third Super Bowl. And this is where the narrative really starts to become, well, Tom Brady wins championships. Peyton Manning's putting up just stats. Peyton's a regular season quarterback. So 2005, Peyton needs to change that narrative. So what's he do? He comes out here, has another 14-2 season. Not as strong statistically as 2004, but I mean, come on, it's hard to top that. He takes them to a 14-2 record, and they play the wild card Steelers in the playoffs. The famous shoestring tackle game where Jerome Bettis fumbles the ball at the 1-yard line, and then Colts start running it back, but Ben Roethlisberger dives and tackles the defender by the shoelaces. And then, of course, the Colts do have a chance to win, put the game away late, and their kicker, his name's a little hard to pronounce, like Mike Vanderjagt, I want to say, or something like that, number 13. But he talked a big game going into that and misses the kick, not even close. It wasn't like an easy kick. It was maybe like 40, 45 yards, I want to say. It wasn't like an extremely difficult kick, though, either. But, I mean, here's the uprights. This thing was like over here. It just wasn't even close. Like, you knew the second it left his leg that thing wasn't going in. Um, so the Colts made the right move and go get Adam Vinatieri that offseason. So 2006, this was the year Peyton finally gets the monkey off his back. Another solid statistical season, 31 touchdowns, 9 interceptions in the regular season. Second team All-Pro. Then we get to the playoffs, and the playoffs, his stats actually weren't even that incredible. Throws 1,000 yards. I mean, how could it not be incredible, 1,000 yards? But 3 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. Absolute classic of an AFC Championship game between the Patriots and Colts. At the time, the largest postseason comeback in NFL history, I believe, at least in the conference championship game. Frank Reich with the Bills in the early 90s against the Oilers might have been a larger comeback. Forget the exact numbers on that, but Indianapolis goes on to upset Brady in the conference championship game, and then they take care of Drew Brees' leftovers and Rex Grossman in the Super Bowl down there in the rain in Miami. Peyton gets his first ring. He's feeling good about himself, and then he ends up having 4 more seasons with the Colts here, where from 2007 to 2010, I mean, again, it's more of the same. You know what to expect. It's around 4,000 yards, 30 touchdowns, 15 interceptions. That's par for Peyton Manning. And in 2008 and 2009, he wins MVP both of those years. First team All-Pro both of those years. I mean, let's look at Peyton's body of work here with the Colts. So he has 1, 2, 3 second team All-Pros, and then another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 first team All-Pros. So seven times he's on the All-Pro team in his time with Indianapolis over 13 seasons. And in 2009, they go 14-2. And they actually went 14-0 that year, and they benched Peyton the last 2 games. If they wanted the perfect season, honestly, they could have had it at least in the regular season, because get to the playoffs and they beat the Ravens, the Jets, and the AFC. So they didn't have to worry about Brady, didn't have to worry about Roethlisberger, didn't have to worry about their defenses. Although the Ravens and Jets were no slouch on defense either. Ray Lewis and Revis Island. Then they get to the Super Bowl against the Saints, and we know the story there. Surprise onside kick at the start of the second half. Even then, Indianapolis still had a chance to put it away. Well, not to put it away, to tie it up late in the game. They were driving. They were down near the red zone, but Tracy Porter strikes again. Finished off Brett Favre the round before, and now he finishes off Peyton this time. So then we get to 2010, last season with the Colts. Rex Ryan gets his revenge in the wild card round there. They upset the Colts in Indianapolis, and we didn't know it at the time, but that was Peyton's last game as an Indianapolis Colt. He would miss all of 2011 with a neck injury. So then the big talk coming into the 2012 season was, what's going to happen with Peyton? Because now the Colts were in a position where they were so bad, they were first overall again, and they were in a position to get Andrew Luck. So was Luck going to sit behind Peyton? Was Peyton going to get traded? The Colts had a bit of a money situation with Peyton, and there was the injury concern. So Colts said, you know what, we'll just cut our losses and roll with Luck, and made him a free agent. At the time, I mean, he was probably the most coveted free agent I could really remember in NFL history, and he's still, nothing really quite matches up like the 2012 Peyton Manning sweepstakes. I mean, my God, we're talking about a guy we're saying is the second greatest quarterback of all time, and for a while he was my GOAT for the quarterback position. And he was just a free agent for anybody to sign. The Eagles had Michael Vick at the time, but even then I was like, you know what, like, Peyton's out there, let's try to go get him, why not? But he ends up going to Denver, and he has a nice little run there. He comes out his first year, like, and doesn't miss a beat. Honestly, he even looks a little bit better than he did in Indianapolis, in my opinion, at least his later years in Indianapolis. If we want to look at like 2010 compared to 2012, he was better in 2012. I don't really think that was much of a debate here. 37 touchdowns, 11 interceptions, just shy of 4,700 yards passing. But like when he was with the Colts, it's all about the playoffs, right? So we get to the playoffs here, and they go one and done. This was the Jacoby Jones game where Denver defender gets caught flat-footed, just backpedaling, trying to catch up with him. Just may as well have fallen over. Jacoby Jones just has a wide open field, and the elite quarterback Joe Flacco outduels Peyton Manning. Just kidding. Joe Flacco's not elite. Don't say it. Sorry, don't tell Ravens fans. That was a really incredible postseason by Joe Flacco, though I will give him that. Caught lightning in a bottle, though. 2013. So Peyton comes out this year, and he goes just absolutely bonkers this year. Close to 5,500 passing yards, 55 touchdowns. That hasn't even been touched since then. So even in this era with Patrick Mahomes running around, this still stands as the best raw statistical season, I would say, ever, although I don't think it's quite as impressive even as his 2004 season. So even though it's weird, right? Because this might be the greatest quarterback season of all time, but it might not even be Peyton's best season as a quarterback. He does throw 6 more touchdowns this season than 2004 and almost 1,000 more yards, but he threw the ball 152 more times, so take that at what you will. But the 2013 Denver offense, absolutely lethal. He's got Wes Welker, he's got Demaryius Thomas, Eric Decker, and they end up going, Julius Thomas, like they were loaded. They ended up going all the way to the Super Bowl that year, and he played well in the 2 games leading up to that. They beat New England in the AFC Championship game, and it seemed like around this time, the tables were starting to turn with Brady and Manning. Peyton had been to the Super Bowl in 2009 and 2006 now. I mean, Brady did get back in 2007 and 2011, but Brady hadn't won a Super Bowl at this point since 2004. And now Peyton had beaten him in 2006 and 2013 head-to-head in the playoffs. So they were 2-2 in the playoffs against each other. Excuse me. But then we get to the Super Bowl, much hyped up matchup between what was seen as best offense in the league in Denver, best defense in the league in Seattle, Legion of Boom, as we all know. But this might be the worst Super Bowl ever. This was definitely the worst Super Bowl I've ever seen myself. The Seahawks just absolutely embarrassed the Broncos. You knew it was over right away. The Broncos give up a safety on the first play of the game on a botch snap, and it just only got worse from there. Sorry, Peyton. He really deserved better than this, but as we'll see, he gets his redemption in 2 years later here. Kind of makes up for this season, in my opinion, where they really deserved a ring here. So 2014, this season in the middle here, this is probably his least mentioned season with the Broncos. Probably the one that gets reflected on the least, I guess I'll say. So they go 12-4. He has 4,700 yards, 39 touchdowns, 15 interceptions. Seems like more of the same from Peyton, honestly, right? Right. Like, he's not missing a step. He's 38 years old, but he's chugging along just fine. But for me, when they get to the playoffs this year, and they match up in the divisional round in Denver against none other than Andrew Luck and the Indianapolis Colts. This was the game where Father Time caught up with Peyton, in my opinion. He doesn't have a bad game, 211 yards, 1 touchdown, no interceptions, but just a 56% completion percentage, 26 completions on 46 attempts, only 5 yards an attempt. Like, really, really not great stuff here from Peyton. Only 8 yards per completion, by far the worst in his playoff career. And the Colts won this game, which was shocking at the time. Everybody thought we were on a collision course for another Brady-Peyton matchup in the conference championship game, but it ended up being Andrew Luck versus Tom Brady, and what ended up being the Deflategate game. But in the 2015 offseason, there was definitely some concern, like, yeah, Peyton might be on his way out. Like, it definitely seems like Father Time's starting to catch up with him. But then in 2015, of course, this is his swan song. He ends up missing a lot of time. Brock Osweiler filling in. And then they get to the postseason. Peyton ends up coming back in. And he does what he needs to. He doesn't have a great playoff, but he just takes care of business. The Denver defense was much improved from 2 years before, so he kind of just had to be more of a game manager. he had a touchdown percentage of just 2.2 here with 2 touchdowns, 1 interception over 3 games. But again, only 1 interception over 3 games. So he's taking care of the football, at least just enough. Um, and they were able to defeat the Carolina Panthers in Super Bowl 50. Peyton rides off into the sunset with his Budweiser, gets his second Super Bowl ring. Doesn't get the MVP, of course, because, I mean, he's kind of just a corpse out there at that point. I'm sorry, that's disrespectful. He was managing the game. The defense helped him with that one for sure. Um, but yeah, that's Peyton Manning's career. I think he's second best all time for sure. So when all's said and done, 5 MVPs, wins another one with the Broncos, and then he adds on another 2 first-team All-Pros with Denver. I mean, it's hard to argue with this. Like the quarterback position changed once Peyton Manning came in the league. What we expect from the quarterback position changed. You even look at we know who number one is, and those two guys kind of go hand in hand. Tom Brady learned a lot from watching Peyton Manning, and Tom Brady, he has a lot of qualities that make him absolutely amazing in his own right. He's the ultimate competitor, but seeing Peyton Manning, seeing his pre-snap ability, seeing how he was able to read a defense, you can't look at me with a straight face and tell me that didn't rub off on Tom Brady at all, because it absolutely did. And that's part of the reason why Tom Brady was as successful as he was late into his career as he was. So I feel like that's a perfect segue into number one here. So Thomas Edward Patrick Brady. What else is there to say that hasn't already been said? Love him or hate him, this guy's the GOAT. He really is. So, of course, 6th-round pick in 2000, 199th overall. The ultimate everyman story. Proof that never give up, kids. Dreams do come true if you really put your heart and soul into it. You really just never stop trying. The sky's the limit. Only plays in one game his first year. 1 completion for 6 yards on 3 attempts behind Drew Bledsoe. And he works his way up to being the full-time backup for the second season. We know the story. Mo Lewis just drills Drew Bledsoe in week 2. Brady comes in. The rest is history. I mean, what else is there to say with this guy? He has a solid run here in the 2000s where pretty much 25 touchdowns, 15 interceptions roughly. That's kind of the bar for him. That's not a bad place to be at all. Not a bad place to be at all. He does exactly what he needs to. He's not putting 49 touchdowns up like Peyton was in 2004, but he won 3 Super Bowls with the Patriots. Granted, he had an incredible coaching staff, incredible defense, but at the same time, Peyton Manning did have Reggie Wayne, Marvin Harris, and Dallas Clark. Tom Brady really didn't have playmakers like that in the early 2000s. He was out there with Deion Branch and not really much else. They were more of a running team, honestly. Corey Dillon back there, but then we get to another incredible thing with Brady. He doesn't lose a playoff game his first 4 years in the league because they win the Super Bowl 2001, 2003, 2004, 2002. Missed the playoffs, so it wasn't until 2005 where he loses his first playoff game. And let's look at these playoff numbers. So 2001 really wasn't anything impressive. Just 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Like I said, coming out of that run, that Super Bowl was seen as kind of a fluke in the mainstream. Definitely a lot of people who weren't sold on the Patriots, especially after they missed the playoffs the next year. But he comes back in 2003, especially in that Super Bowl against Carolina. And that game, it started off so boring, but then right around the 2-minute warning in the first half, from there on, Tom Brady just takes off. He just unlocks another gear where really he just doesn't look back from that the rest of his career. And here's the thing, that's just he goes from gear 1 to gear 2. He ends up at gear 5 by the end of his career. He just keeps on getting better. And that's another thing with him. He's the ultimate competitor, ultimate leader, just wants the guys around him to be better, but he wants himself to always be getting better too. As his career goes along, you could tell he starts taking better care of himself. He starts working out more, starts eating better, starts studying film more, starts working out with his teammates more, starts building chemistry with them, and the results back it up. So we get to 2006 here. He has 3 games started, 5 touchdowns, 4 interceptions in the playoffs. They lose that heartbreaker in the conference championship to the Colts. I mean, say heartbreaker. The Patriots are pretty heartless at the time, so take it how you will. But that offseason, the Deflategate comes out. Not Deflategate, Spygate. Jeez. Spygate comes out that offseason about, oh, the Patriots were recording teams and, all their championships should be illegitimate. And Belichick's a fraud and Brady's a cheater. So what do? They come out in 2007. Well, one, they trade for Randy Moss. And they bring in, I believe they brought in Junior Seau that offseason on their already loaded defense. And they go 16-0. These guys go 16-0. Like, that's like something you do in Madden, right? Like, you're like, oh, I'm going to just run up the score every week. I'm going to throw 50 touchdowns and throw 23 of them to Moss, and we're going to win every game. That's what they did in real life. And then they get to the playoffs, and it just keeps on continuing. So he starts 3 games in the playoffs that year, 737 yards, 6 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, but of course they only put up 14 points in the Super Bowl and lose to Michael Strahan and the Giants. So bitter ending to an otherwise fantastic season. This is another one of those seasons where this is up there for greatest quarterback season ever. Like Peyton 2004 and 2013 is definitely up there. Rodgers in 2011 and 2020 are up there. Dan Marino in 1984 absolutely is up there. Man, like, this one's definitely in the conversation, though, especially considering they didn't lose a game. Really remarkable stuff. And coming off of that, though, in 2008, this is really the only major injury he has in his career, and it's to a torn ACL. So he starts just 1 game, first week of the season. He's out for the season. And he doesn't come back until 2009. The Patriots actually go 11-5 without him, with none other than 7th-round pick Matt Castle. So it's definitely some conversation about, well, just how important is Brady to the Patriots? Is it Tom Brady or is it Tom Brady? Is he just part of Belichick's system? Belichick's this offensive mastermind, and Tom Brady's just a cog in that system who buys into it, which, as we'll see later on, isn't necessarily true. So he comes back in 2009. It's more of the same, like his pre-2007 stuff. They get bounced first round of the playoffs. They only go 10-6. They get embarrassed at home by Baltimore. Then 2010, he comes out, 14-2 season, 36 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, wins his second MVP. Again, they get one and done, this time in the divisional round to Rex and the Jets. This was the Jets Super Bowl basically that year. I know they wanted to win the real thing, but they celebrated like it was the real Super Bowl. Still was absolutely rooting for the Jets in that game, though, don't get me wrong. In 2011, keep in mind, he's already 34 by the time we get to 2011 here. 39 touchdowns, 12 interceptions, and that wasn't even good enough for an All-Pro that year because quarterbacks were just so strong that season. But the Patriots do go to the Super Bowl again that year. Again, lose to the Giants and Eli Manning. Another last-second dime, this time to Mario Manningham instead of David Tyree, but moving along. So this is the start of an 8-year stretch where the Patriots go to the conference championship game. Try to shorten this up a little bit just for the sake of time, but go to 8 straight AFC championship games here. They win the Super Bowl again in 2014, 2016, and 2018. While he gets an MVP in 2017, but they lost to... Wait, they lost to the Eagles with that. All right, that's cool. So then they get to 2019 was his last season in New England, which honestly, just from a football fan's point of view, like kind of tragic he had to leave New England, but it's also very exciting because we were able to really see how Belichick and Brady could have done apart from each other. That's what everybody really wanted to know, right? How would these two do when they were apart from each other? So we got to see in 2020 just that. And Tom Brady comes out with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers of all teams. The COVID hindered season. And he throws for 4,600 yards, 40 touchdowns, and 12 interceptions, going on to win his 7th Super Bowl. So, I mean, geez, like, not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, not 6. Lordy, lordy. And that playoffs, he goes 4-0. They were a wild card that year, too. Goes 4-0, over 1,000 yards in the air, 10 touchdowns to just 3 interceptions, a 7.2 touchdown percentage. Very close to the best mark of his career. Only 2014 was better. And this was at age 43. I mean, I know people will say, oh, well, the rings are the most impressive thing with Tom Brady. I did say after this season, I changed my stance that he was the GOAT. It wasn't even because of the ring. You look at the statistics he had in the regular season, but those postseason stats too. 10 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, 1,000 yards in the playoffs, and they beat some quality teams. They ended Drew Brees' career, literally ended his career. That was his last game. And then they defeated Aaron Rodgers and the Packers in the conference championship game, which honestly was probably, I would say that season was Rodgers' best crack at a Super Bowl after he won 45. But then you would think he'd just ride off into the sunset there. But Brady once more he comes back for he wants for number 8. He's coming back for more in 2021 in a 17-game season. So the season's longer now, and he's like, you know what, I'm still gonna do it. So he comes back and throws for 5,316 yards as a 44-year-old man, excuse me. 44-year-old man leads them to a 13-4 record. And this season, honestly, might have even been more impressive than the last one. He finishes second in the MVP voting, second team All-Pro. And like, if you had any doubts that this man was the GOAT, this season right here proves it, even more so than 2020, honestly. I had him in fantasy this season. He was the gift that kept on giving. He really was. I got him in like round 11 too. But then he comes back for one more year in 2022. Because honestly, in the 2021 playoffs, they beat in the wild card round. And then they lose to the LA Rams in the divisional round. But I mean, real talk, if the Bucks were able to win that game against the Rams in the divisional round, there's a very good chance he does win number 8 that year. They were playing that well. They really were playing that well. And Tom Brady was playing that well. He was putting the team on his back. But then he comes back last year in 2022. And this one, I mean, this is still really fresh. Doesn't have a bad season, but definitely one of his weaker seasons for sure. He kind of regresses back to that 25 touchdown range. He throws 25 and 9, 40, just shy of 4,700 yards. And Bucks have an 8-9 record, and they end up going. They end up beating the Cowboys in the first round of the playoffs that year, and then losing in the second round to. Oh wait, I'm sorry. Excuse me. They go 1-done to Dallas. Sorry, I'm not used to Dallas winning playoff games. I don't know why that tripped me up. It was literally just last year. Dallas beat them, and then they go on to lose. Dallas loses to San Francisco. Yeah, the Bucks were 1-done. So that is Thomas Edward Patrick Brady's career. That is the number 1 quarterback of all time. This was really fun to do. So maybe I'll make some more videos like this. Maybe a little bit shorter. Sorry, I know not everybody wants to sit through 2-hour and 20-minute videos, but I could really talk about this stuff all day. That's how much I love this. So. Yeah, let me know what your guys' thoughts are. I want to know. Brady's probably your GOAT too, but how will the rest of the rankings shake out? Love to hear that. So that's all I got. Peace out.